All right, this is our third lesson on cells, and I want to focus just on this lesson on the cytoskeleton and how cells move. I wanted to kind of separate this out because I thought this might be something you were less familiar with. Now, some of you may not be aware, but cells do have a skeleton. It's kind of strange to think about, but it's called the cytoskeleton. This is a set of fibers that exist within the cell. They're not normally visible under the microscope or anything like that, but they exist between the nucleus and the cell membrane, and their job is to provide support for the cell, but also to transport substances within the cell. So think of them in some respects kind of like a highway or a freeway, a transport system of some kind that's moving some of these cell organelles and other things within the cell. Now, the first component of the cytoskeleton is something called microtubules. Microtubules are the largest of the three different types of fibers that you find within the cell. These are long, hollow cylinders, and they're composed of this protein called tubulin. Tubulin is a globular protein made up of two polypeptide chains. So each one of these little individual circles here is representing two polypeptide chains that are wound around each other into a globular protein. Remember, globular is a round protein. Now notice that there's a bunch of these. This is a huge structure. There's a bunch of them all together forming a tube. You can't kind of tell from this picture, but it's hollow in the center. And like I said, these are the largest of the components of the cytoskeleton. Now microtubules are components of both cilia and flagella. So we're going to diverge a little bit and talk about cilia and flagella. They are responsible for the movement of whole cells. So we're not talking about movement of things inside the cell, but the whole cell moving around. This long tail here is a flagella, and these little hairs that are all around this cell are cilia. So flagella are these whip-like tails. They propel a cell by whipping back and forth, kind of in a circular motion. They're most common in prokaryotic cells, although you do see flagella on, for instance, sperm cells and some plants. Cells usually have one or two of these, not a whole lot of them. And they're composed of microtubules arranged with 9 pair around a central 10th pair. So you can see here, these are your tubules, your microtubules, paired up around this structure, and then in the center you have a 10th pair, and that's the structure of the flagella. Cilia, on the other hand, are shorter in length, and they're like little hairs covering the surface. Many of them will be covering a surface if a cell has these. Unlike the flagella, which usually cells have just one or two, cilia, they may have hundreds and thousands of them. Cilia move in a circular pattern by sliding of microtubules. And I have this diagram here where you see the direction of motion for a flagella is up and down, and the direction of motion for cilia is kind of back and forth motion. Both of them are able to propel cells. Now, microtubules, due to their structure, can rapidly grow and shrink by adding or removing tubulin. So you can see the little globular proteins can be added on one end and to lengthen it, or taken away on that end to shorten it. So they can rapidly grow and shrink. And they're extremely important for cell division. They make up centrioles, and they make up the spindle fibers that direct the movement of chromosomes during mitosis, which we will talk about in a few weeks. Again, they also make up cilia and flagella, as I said. The second different type of fiber that you find within the cytoskeleton is called a microfilament. A microfilament is very thin and long. They're made of a twisted polypeptide chain that is composed of 2 monomers of actin. Actin is a fibrous protein, and you can see here, actually I take that back. Actin is globular, but the actin protein is made into a long filament. That would be, I guess, the quaternary structure. And then together they're wound into a long filament. So 2 polypeptide monomers. They influence cell shape and help in movement. One of the things that they do is during cytokinesis, which is cells dividing, animal cells dividing, they actually pull the cell together in the center, which pinches it off and forms two new cells. You can see that the microfilaments are at the exterior part of the cell, and they're involved in giving the cell its shape. Finally, the third type of fiber that you find making up the cytoskeleton are the intermediate filaments, and they're simply called that because they're intermediate in size. They're medium-sized. Their job is to form a supportive network for cells. There are many different forms of intermediate filaments, which differ depending on the type of cell. Now let's talk a little bit about cell motility. Motility refers to movement, ability to move of cells. All cells move in some way. They either contract, they might stretch, or their cytoplasm might be moving around. Some of them obviously can swim with cilia or flagella. And all of this movement is due to the parts of the cytoskeletal components. As they grow and shrink, anything that's attached is going to be dragged along. So when you think about growth of the microfilaments or the microtubules, anything that's attached to them is moved as well. So here are some examples. Microfilaments in, this is a white blood cell, allow the cell to stretch out. All of these little fibers that look like they're coming out are actually the cell itself. The membrane is stretching due to the microfilaments pushing, and in this case, this cell is going to seek out and destroy some pathogen. It kind of looks like a red blood cell, but we can imagine it might be a bacteria or some other kind of pathogen. That's one example. Another example is shown here. This is actually the structure that allows your muscles to contract. In this case, we have a myosin filament here, which is a similar protein to actin, and then we have our microfilament here, the actin microfilaments. And these molecules interact with one another by attaching and detaching, growing and shrinking, and that's actually how muscles contract. Finally, we have some of the microfilaments that are involved in what's called cytoplasmic streaming. In this case, this is a plant cell, and all of the parts that are in the cytoplasm, think about all those organelles that you discussed, including mitochondria, they can be attached to microfilaments and dragged along, so kind of like a conveyor belt inside the cell. So those are the details that I wanted you to know about the cytoskeleton. Make sure you refer to your book as well if you're confused about anything, and bring me any questions you have in class.